Okay, so off the back of my Strange New Worlds Season 2 Episode 3 review, I definitely believe this needs one of my addendum videos. There were a lot of problems with this episode. I didn't really get the chance in my review to really talk about what needs to be talked about, to break down some of the problems that this episode creates within its own runtime. Now, if you were to switch your brain off with this episode whilst watching it, then you would probably be in for a mostly entertaining time. However, the more critical thinkers among us would see, no doubt, the immense amount of conveniences that would have to happen, the immense amount of plot holes that this episode generates within its own story. So I thought I'd just break down some of those points here today. So in the episode we have temporal investigations, or the Department of Temporal Investigations. Now we have this gentleman come onto the ship. He's been shot in the past and he recruits La'an to take over his mission. He's failed his mission, and then we see the Flash, which changes the Enterprise, and I will get to that very, very shortly. The Department of Temporal Investigations is part of the Federation, according to the woman we meet at the end of the episode, and Department of Temporal Investigations investigates temporal anomalies and any contact that any Starfleet crews have in terms of time travel, which, to be honest, really confuses me, because most of Discovery involved time travel of sorts and involved the Starship Discovery jumping forward 900 years in what I believe to be the most ridiculous direction for it to take. Temporal Investigations apparently now investigate throughout history, and they say that La'an can't discuss anything that happens from the future. Instead of Temporal Investigations in this time period dealing with it, they make it a temporal organization, as opposed to someone essentially like the temporal equivalent of the FBI in Star Trek. Now, I mentioned earlier the changes in the timeline. As soon as this gentleman passes away, there is a flash on board the Enterprise and everything is different. In this episode, Khan Noonien Singh never rose to power and the Federation was never born. It was a different organization that was born that is oddly practically identical. The Enterprise is the same. The crew are the same, as I found hysterical in my review. Erica's hair is completely unchanged. Captain Kirk, or this version of Captain Kirk, is now in charge of the Enterprise. He is the captain of the Enterprise. We see Mr. Spock as well, and apparently Vulcans and humans first contact and all of that stuff didn't really happen the way that it was supposed to happen, and Spock is still in the episode somehow, although he must be a full-blooded Vulcan because he wasn't born to a Vulcan mother. Now, this would change his appearance somewhat, you would think, unless his father's genes are certainly the strongest. It would make absolutely no sense. The entire opening of the episode is completely and utterly nonsensical. La'an and Kirk get transported back in time just after one of the most ridiculous scenes I've ever seen, where she's essentially an intruder on this ship because she never existed, because, well, you know, Khan never rose to power and she was never born. So Captain Kirk, in his infinite wisdom, says, "Who are you? What are you doing on my ship?" and then just goes off for a private conversation. The bridge crew all look confused and dazed by what's going on, and yeah, no one looks any different. Uhura's hair isn't different. Erica's hair isn't different. The uniforms aren't really massively different. You would think they would be, but the Enterprise itself, the fact that the Enterprise exists, means that some form of Starfleet does exist, but it doesn't, and the ship looks just exactly the same. Also, if the Romulans in this episode were trying to stifle human advancement, they clearly didn't manage it, because you know, the ship is out in space. We have moved out into space, and it looks like the Union Federation type organization in this timeline does exist, and it appears as if we ventured out as far as the edge of the solar system. But we're still meeting Vulcans. We still know what Klingons are, Denobulans are. Obviously Earth has been occupied, but an Earth that's gone through a pretty rough patch. The Enterprise looks really clean and very sort of identical to the other timeline. I found this really ridiculous. Moving on from that utter nonsense, Kirk and La'an find themselves on Earth. Kirk can't work a revolving door because he's not got any kind of common sense or logic to him. He's sort of stammered by a revolving door, which I didn't find funny in the slightest. They quickly realise that they need to find clothes, money, and they've got to blend in. They need currency of some sort. So they go into a department store and they get changed, but not before realising they need money to do so. So La'an plants something into a lady's bag and they manage to escape the store with the clothes that they've bought. So once they realise they've got to get money, Kirk decides to hustle some chess. As I mentioned in my review, it doesn't look like he anteed up beforehand, so these people are just playing him on his word, and he gets loads of loose cash, to which they're able to buy some hot dogs and some food and find a place to stay for the night in what has to be one of the poshest hotels I've ever seen. It's not a motel or a dive or anything like that with this loose change that Kirk won. And as I mentioned, convenience wise, they just happen to pick a hotel room opposite the bridge that is then destroyed. Another convenience is they just happen to run into this Romulan, who it's not revealed at this point that she's a Romulan, but she's taken photographic evidence of the wreckage, and that apparently is just not convenient enough. We get into the world's slowest and dullest car following chase scene I've ever seen. I say car following chase scene, it's not verbal diarrhea, it is literally trying to describe what I saw. And they steal a red Dodge Challenger. It's that colour red again. Red door, red angels, red signal, red matter, red car. They seem to really like the colour red. It is getting just a little bit tedious seeing all these nods to this colour. So Kirk and La'an, they get pulled over by the police and arrested for reckless driving. The Romulan lady comes along and talks the police out of doing anything to these two people. He's not able to present a license because obviously he's from the future and he doesn't have a license. He's driving this really sort of extravagant car, and the police just let him off with a warning because they have to go elsewhere. If you remember Picard Season 2, the police were completely useless in that, and apparently the police are completely useless in this and do not do their job. So they end up having a conversation with the Romulan lady that they don't know what is a Romulan, and she's trying to uncover a Romulan plot. Although she is the Romulan plot, the plot is to stop humankind from progressing to the point where they can build Constitution class ships. So even if she succeeds, clearly she's failed, and Earth isn't really in for much of a rough time, although it's stated in the episode that they are in for a rough time. So they go and meet Pelia, the new engineer. Her species are long-lived. She's in the past, kind of like a Guinan situation from The Next Generation with Time's Arrow and all of that stuff. It's the same sort of thing. She's lived on Earth for many years. She's seen so many social changes in our society. They concoct a cold fusion detecting watch. They find the cold fusion area, and it just so happens to be called the Noonien Singh Institute, which I thought again was really daft and quite obvious and massively convenient that it's all happening in one area. Now, Kirk does get shot and he dies. He dies after being a little bit too cocky and misreading the situation. Kirk is quite aloof in this episode. He is played for laughs. I didn't appreciate it, and I still don't now. La'an subdues the Romulan after Kirk is shot, and she meets Little Khan and saves him. And she's got to come to terms with the fact that she saved her ancestor whilst actually saving herself, because if the Romulans succeeded, then she wouldn't never have existed. She ends up back on her Enterprise, and we see Captain Pike for all of one scene. Clearly at this point, Anson Mount was off being a new father, so he was pretty much written out of a lot of the episodes, it would seem, early on. La'an contacts Kirk. Kirk and her have a conversation. Clearly he doesn't remember her. They've never met, and she has herself a good cry. Now, this episode looks like it is leading into the crossover of the century, the one that we all know is coming, that is being massively hyped up with Star Trek Lower Decks. We'll see. Now, I've just mentioned only a few of the massive conveniences that had to happen in order to get this episode done and this story told. The episode itself is amongst some of the weakest writing I have known from any new Trek so far, and that's saying something. As I said, it's massively entertaining if you switch your brain off to all reason and logic, and it would seem that the character of Kirk in this episode also did the same, because he behaves so illogically all of the time. Now, Strange New Worlds had a bit of a rocky start, but it didn't have a massively bad start. In general, it's not an entirely bad show. It has its moments where it does sort of shine the tiniest little light into the world of Star Trek, but it really does not come up with anything original. Now, this season of Strange New Worlds isn't exactly hitting many of the marks. The second episode was about the closest it has come so far to being Star Trek. It wasn't too bad of an episode. It wasn't great, but it wasn't too bad. With this episode, it falls right back off the cliff again. The entire story didn't work. It didn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense in relation to other Star Trek shows. It doesn't make sense in the canon. Now, there is some talks that this could be the proof that this is set in an alternate timeline. I genuinely don't think they're intelligent enough to pull that one off, because they can't even get a simple time travel episode right. Now, time travel episodes can be a bit of a minefield for any person who reviews the episode, because certain things don't make sense. You know, it's often explained in these episodes why it doesn't make sense, or there's some contrivance that they come up with in order to make it make sense, or let it off the fact that it doesn't. But this episode doesn't do that. It doesn't do any of the exposition needed to justify its own existence. It's a complete mess. It is just an excuse to not spend as much money on the budget, to have an episode set in today's time, so they don't have to light the sets, they don't have to have most of the cast in the episode itself. It is just an excuse to save money. And to be fair, if I was in charge of New Trek, I'd have probably fired the writers a long time ago. This episode is so piss poorly written. It is just atrocious. Now, I did say at the beginning of my review that the title of this episode I thought was unoriginal, and they didn't really put much thought into it. Now, of course, I have since been told it is a Shakespeare reference. I have not read much Shakespeare, not since I was at school. I don't really have any need for it. So in regards to things like that, I'm occasionally going to miss something, drop the ball, not be that well informed about Shakespeare. At the end of the day, this is Star Trek. I have spent my life watching Star Trek. I know Star Trek, and this simply is not it. I also completely by accident ended up watching the episode of the Orville, which is titled the same. Now, the Orville is one of the best sci-fi shows to come out of television in the last 10 years. This show, however, is quite poor. In terms of ideas, it's got nothing new. It is not Strange New Worlds. It is an absolute derivative, unoriginal nightmare at times. The second season is not going well so far. If it continues this trend, I would fully expect this show to go the way that Discovery has gone. And with the cancellation of Star Trek Prodigy show and Star Trek Discovery, we are starting to see a trend where these shows just aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. I fully expect in a few years' time for Star Trek to be sold to another company, or to be auctioned off. The quality of the writing is not representative of what Star Trek used to be. If you like these types of videos, if you like these addendums, then please show them some love. They're not as popular as my normal reviews, but I will keep doing them just because I find it really fun to talk about when I need to do an addendum. So if you like this video, then let me know by hitting that like button, leaving a comment, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Please look after yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.